resilience and energy security. It is in the collective interest of the international community to ensure respect for and uphold the right of unimpeded transit passage in the Strait of Hormuz, as well as in all other straits used for international navigation. Madam President, the current situation in the Strait of Hormuz, where transit passage has been impeded, is of great concern. We call on all concerned parties to uphold and respect the right of transit passage, comply with all other applicable obligations under international law, restore safe and unimpeded transit passage in the Strait of Hormuz, and ensure the safety of seafarers and ships. Madam President, please allow me to also make some additional remarks in my national capacity. Singapore had welcomed the announcement of a 2-week ceasefire in the Middle East on the 8th of April 2026. We are encouraged by the steps towards de-escalation and commend the efforts of the mediators, in particular Pakistan. We urge the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran to continue down the path of dialogue and redouble efforts in negotiations that will lead to the permanent end to the conflict and lasting peace and stability in the region. Safe and unimpeded transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz, in accordance with international law and UNCLOS, must be restored. The safety of seafarers and ships must be ensured, and Singapore also endorses the statement to be made later by the Philippines on behalf of ASEAN. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore, also on behalf of Fiji, Malta and Jamaica. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iceland, also on behalf of Finland and Norway, followed by the Philippines and Liechtenstein.
Madam President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of Finland, Norway and my own country, Iceland. First, allow me to pay tribute to the originators of General Assembly Resolution 76-262. This resolution is proving itself an effective tool for holding to account the permanent members of the Security Council in all circumstances where the veto is used. The Security Council bears primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. It carries out its duties on behalf of the entire membership. It is entirely right and proper that the permanent 5 explain their use of a veto and the consequent failure of that Council to act in the cause of peace and security. We also remain supportive of the General Assembly, considering its own role in situations where the Council is unable to act. The casting of the veto by China and the Russian Federation at the Council meeting of April 7th prevented the Council once again from taking concerted and decisive action to re-establish peace and security. The resolution aimed to address a key aspect of the conflict in the region, namely the protection of global commons in the shape of the Strait of Hormuz, as a vital international shipping lane, and the responsibility of all parties to refrain from further escalation and cease all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in compliance with international law. Freedom of navigation is a cornerstone of the law of the sea and must be upheld. The failure to resolve these issues risks massive damage to the global economy and severe impact on millions of ordinary people, particularly in countries already in a situation of food insecurity. We thank Bahrain and other GCC countries for their attempt to bring all member states on board. The resolution went through a number of iterations and was in its final iteration limited to purely defensive measures and was designed to prevent escalation. The failure of the Council to respond risks widening further the credibility gap when it comes to the Council's role in peace and security. The vetoes cast last week prevent the further development of Resolution 2817, in which the Council condemned any actions or threats aimed at closing, obstructing, or otherwise interfering with international navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. This resolution was supported by a record number, 138 UN member states, including our countries. Madam President, with conflicts escalating in the Middle East region and elsewhere, causing devastating humanitarian consequences for millions, the Security Council must turn a new page. The Security Council needs to be a forum in which tough positions are resolved, not simply showcased. We support the UN's leadership through the Council and by the Secretary General. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iceland, also on behalf of Finland and Norway. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 11 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations: Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Vietnam, and my own country, the Philippines. ASEAN expresses deep concern over the developments in the Middle East and their implications for regional and global peace and stability. In the ASEAN Foreign Ministers' Statement of 13 April 2026 on the developments in the Middle East, we welcome the announcement of the 2-week ceasefire between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran on 8 April 2026, and underscore the importance of its full and effective implementation. We reaffirm the importance of maintaining maritime safety and security and upholding freedom of navigation in and over flight above straits used for international navigation, in accordance with international law, including the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the relevant standards and recommended practices by the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization. In this regard, we call for the restoration of the safe, unimpeded, and continuous transit passage of vessels and aircraft in the Strait of Hormuz in line with the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, as well as for all parties to ensure the safety of seafarers and ships in accordance with the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. We urge the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran to continue negotiations that will lead to the permanent end of the conflict and lasting peace and stability in the region. We commend the efforts of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and all parties involved for the collaborative efforts in this regard. We call for the full and effective implementation of the ceasefire, aimed at preventing further suffering and loss of lives, ensuring maritime security and freedom of navigation and overflight, especially for merchant, non-combatant vessels and aircraft in accordance with the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, minimizing disruption to the flow of energy and essential goods, and mitigating its adverse impact on global economic stability. We urge all parties involved to maintain conducive conditions for the full and effective implementation of the ceasefire, exercising utmost restraint, ceasing all hostilities, acting responsibly, avoiding any acts that may aggravate the situation, and working collectively towards a comprehensive and enduring resolution in accordance with international law, the United Nations Charter, and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We underscore the importance of maintaining regional peace, stability, and prosperity, upholding international law, and promoting earnest dialogue and diplomacy as the primary means of addressing conflicts and tensions, including the need for a complete and immediate cessation of hostilities across all fronts in the Middle East. We further reaffirm the obligations of all states to resolve their differences through peaceful means, to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure in armed conflicts, and to ensure the safety and security of UN peacekeepers and humanitarian personnel in line with international law, the UN Charter, and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Philippines on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein, recalling the time limit of statements for delegations speaking in their national capacity of 5 minutes, followed by Egypt and Japan.
Morning, Madam President. Thank you for convening this assembly in a timely manner after the casting of a veto by the Russian Federation and China on draft resolution 2026/273 proposed by Bahrain on behalf of a group of states in the Security Council. We appreciate the production of a special report by the Council in the presence of both vetoing states at today's meeting, both of which are in line with the provisions of Resolution 76262, otherwise known as the Veto Initiative. We look forward to receiving a summary of today's meeting to be sent to the Council for their reflection in line with Resolution 79327. Madam President, the situation regarding the Strait of Hormuz is of significant concern across the world, not simply because of the armed conflict that has led to the situation in and around the strait, but because of the consequences for global shipping and for the transit of vital energy supplies, foodstuffs and fertilizers, and the massive impact on the global economy. The conflict is making life unaffordable for many and will undoubtedly leave the most vulnerable hungry. We appreciated the initiative to bring a resolution addressing the situation in the interests of populations the world over, indeed, of all of us. We also appreciate the efforts by the drafters to listen to Council members with concerns over the text, while this has unfortunately not resulted in a resolution that was able to be adopted by the Council. It is important that measures taken by the Council are commensurate with the threats they are meant to address, including through appropriate temporal and geographical limitations. We also note in this context that the draft did contain some ambiguity, in particular with respect to the chapter under which the Council is deriving its legal authority for the measures contained in the text, a more general problem with respect to the drafting of Council resolutions. We encourage all drafters of such texts to specify under which chapter they intend the Council to act. Madam President, today we find ourselves in a different situation to when the draft was vetoed. Liechtenstein thanks Pakistan and all other states who have worked towards the ceasefire deal between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and urges for its full and complete implementation and the conclusion of a lasting peace agreement. We note that Israel has announced it will enter talks with Lebanon and urge negotiations in good faith on the basis of the aforementioned ceasefire. We also thank the Secretary General for the nomination of Jean Arnaud as his personal envoy on the Middle East conflict and its consequences, and express our full support for his work. Madam President, this is a situation where the world rightfully expects action by the political organs of the United Nations. We have listened carefully to the comments offered by Kuwait this morning and look forward to further steps to present a resolution echoing also the call that you yourself have made this morning. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt, followed by Japan and Austria.
السيدة رئيس الجمعية العامة.
Madam President of the General Assembly, since the very first day of the conflict in the Middle East and the Arabian Gulf, Egypt has expressed deep concern regarding the dangerous military escalation in the region. It has warned of the looming threat that this escalation poses, namely the expansion of the conflict causing instability and total chaos, thereby endangering regional and international peace and security. In this context, Egypt reiterates its complete rejection of all forms of aggression against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its sister Arab nations in the Gulf, as well as Jordan and Iraq. We condemn these unacceptable and unjustifiable acts of aggression. We also stress our full solidarity with sister Arab states and our unwavering support for them in the face of any threat to their security and stability. Egypt has therefore co-sponsored Security Council Resolution 2817, adopted by the Council on March 11th. We also stress the need to fully adhere to the UN Charter and international law, including international humanitarian law. This entails completely refraining from targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities, water desalination plants, and residential areas, as such acts constitute grave violations of international law and pose a direct threat to regional stability. We extend our sincere condolences and deepest sympathies to the families of the innocent civilians who have fallen prey to these violations. Madam President, Egypt emphasizes that there can be no military solution to this crisis. Continued escalation will only lead to further violence, destruction, and human suffering, while simultaneously undermining security and stability. In this context, Cairo has made efforts over the past year to build confidence and foster a conducive environment for resolving any concerns regarding the Iranian nuclear program, including by promoting dialogue, diplomatic solutions, and cooperation with the IAEA. So in close cooperation with Pakistan and Turkey, Egypt engaged in intensive consultations with various regional and international parties throughout the war to ensure de-escalation and prevent the situation from reaching a point of no return, ultimately paving the way for a ceasefire and a comprehensive, sustainable settlement. In the same vein, Egypt welcomes the initial steps taken by the Secretary General to revitalize the United Nations role in addressing this conflict, including his appointment of a personal envoy for this matter. Accordingly, Egypt welcomed the announcement by the US President on April 8 of a 2-week suspension of military operations in the region. This is a positive step toward de-escalation and containing tensions. Egypt stresses that the suspension of military operations by the United States, coupled with a corresponding response from the Iranian side, present a vital opportunity that must be seized to pave the way for negotiations, diplomacy, and constructive dialogue. We welcome the convening of a significant round of negotiations between the United States and Iran on Saturday, April 11, in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. We look forward to building on the agreements reached during these talks to promote diplomatic solutions that would bring an end to the war through robust and sustainable arrangements. We underscore the need for building upon this step through full adherence to the cessation of military operations and respect for the freedom of international navigation. We stress that Egypt will continue to make every effort in coordination with Pakistan and Turkey to advance this objective. Egypt joins the vast majority of the peoples and governments of the region and the world calling for an urgent end to this war, the losses and damages of which would only multiply were military operations to resume and were diplomacy and dialogue, which are the sole window of hope for us all, to be abandoned. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. Achieving peace and order in the Gulf and the entire Middle East is of paramount importance, not only for regional stability, but for global peace and security. In this context, ensuring the safety of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz is indispensable to any meaningful normalization of the situation. Japan has consistently supported diplomatic efforts toward early de-escalation. From this perspective, it is regrettable the Security Council could not play a significant role in stabilizing the situation in the Strait of Hormuz at this juncture. Under these circumstances, Japan expresses its respect and support for the mediation efforts by the parties concerned, particularly the recent US-Iran negotiations held in Islamabad. We hope that such diplomatic endeavors will lead to a positive impact on the normalization of transit through the strait. As a vital artery for global commerce, the strait must remain open and safe for international navigation. Current situation in the Strait of Hormuz has been undermining global food and energy security. Japan underscores that ensuring free and safe passage of the Strait of Hormuz constitutes a vital foundation for global socio-economic stability, particularly for those regions such as Asia and Africa that are most directly vulnerable to disruption. In this regard, Japan welcomes the decision made by the IMO Council on March 19th. We call for the relevant parties to take necessary immediate actions to enable establishment of a framework such as a safe maritime corridor to facilitate the safe evacuation of merchant ships. The disruption of maritime transport not only threatens the well-being of seafarers, but also hinders the integrity and viability of the international maritime system. For our part, Japan recently hosted a summit meeting to call for a new framework called Partnership on Wide Energy and Resource Resilience Asia, Power Asia, to cooperate in emergency responses through financing the procurement of crude oil, petroleum products, and maintaining supply chains in Asia, as well as in structural responses such as establishing stockpiling and release system. In conclusion, we call for further diplomatic efforts by member states to restore safe international navigation through the Strait of Hormuz in accordance with international law, as reaffirmed in Security Council Resolution 2817. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria, followed by the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States.
Madam President, Excellencies, colleagues, we gather here today because once again Council action was blocked by the exercise of the veto by 2 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Austria regrets that a matter of profound global consequence went unanswered by the Council. Colleagues, even as a landlocked country, Austria is acutely aware of the importance of maritime security and respect for the rule of law at sea. The legal situation is crystal clear. As a strait used for international navigation and connecting 2 parts of the high seas, all ships enjoy the right to continuous and expeditious passage through the Strait of Hormuz, according to Article 38 of UNCLOS, and also according to customary international law. This right cannot be suspended unilaterally and continues to apply in times of armed conflict. The unilateral blockade of or restrictions to freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz have severe consequences for food and energy security across the world, as many have said before. This threatens to destabilize the global economy, and it risks pushing the most vulnerable countries to the brink of famine. Millions will suffer if this situation remains unaddressed. Madam President, any unilateral actions Restricting the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz or other international straits are therefore completely unacceptable. Austria strongly calls for the freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz to be swiftly restored. We welcome the Secretary General's initiative on fertilizer exports as a pragmatic first step. But let us be clear, we welcome it, but pragmatic workarounds are not a substitute for the rule of law. Iran's international obligations remain untouched by such an initiative. Colleagues, let me speak plainly about the wider situation. Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. For Austria, which has championed the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and has worked towards a world and also a region free of nuclear arms for decades, this conviction is not rhetorical, it is a pillar of our foreign policy. And the people of Iran who have endured decades of repression deserve respect of their human rights and their human dignity. But military escalation is not the answer. Austria is gravely concerned by the further erosion of the international order with the UN Charter at its core. In the same vein, indiscriminate attacks by Iran on its neighbors in the Gulf and in the broader region are completely unacceptable and must stop immediately. This was also expressed by Austria's Foreign Minister Beate Meindl-Reisinger upon her visit to Riyadh only last week. Colleagues, a diplomatic solution is the only way forward. De-escalation and diplomacy are urgently needed. Austria therefore calls on all sides to continue to respect the ceasefire agreed on last week to allow for negotiations. Austria does not simply call for diplomacy and dialogue as a platitude. Federal Chancellor Christian Stocker and our Foreign Minister Beate Meindl-Reisinger have been in constant contact with all partners across the region and with the parties to this conflict. We're grateful to Pakistan and others for their tireless efforts in Islamabad. That those talks did not succeed is a setback, but diplomacy doesn't stop because one round of talks have failed. Vienna has hosted historic negotiations on the Iranian nuclear question before. We stand ready to do so again. Our offer is sincere and our commitment to mediation is unconditional. Colleagues, the only path forward is a peaceful solution. Austria stands ready to do its part to help achieve this goal. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, followed as the new speaking order by Denmark and New Zealand.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Madam President, before delivering my statement, I would like to express Iran's strong objection and serious concerns regarding the biased and one-sided statement delivered by Your Excellency in the capacity of the President of General Assembly, which by departing from the mandate and institutional responsibilities of that office overlooked the root causes of the situation and made unfounded allegations against a member state. It is a well-established principle grounded in the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations and the rule of procedures of the General Assembly that the holder of this office must exercise a strict impartiality and refrain from adopting positions that could compromise the neutrality and credibility of the General Assembly. Madam President, the vetoes cast by China and Russia were timely, justified and necessary. During the Council meeting, my delegation made clear that the text was one-sided and ignored the root causes of the crisis, the illegal and savage war of aggression by the United States and Israel against Iran on 28 February. Its adoption would have set a dangerous precedent, eroding the sovereign rights of the coastal states, undermining the UN Charter and increasing the risk of escalation. Madam President, recent U.S. unlawful actions, including efforts to impose a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, further demonstrate the flawed logic behind the draft. These unlawful measures escalate tensions and threaten both maritime security and international trade. Against this backdrop, I wish to mark the following points. First, the Islamic Republic of Iran, as a responsible state committed to the United Nations Charter and the international law, has consistently upheld freedom of navigation and maritime security in the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman. For decades, Iran has fulfilled its responsibilities in good faith as a coastal state of the Strait of Hormuz, ensuring security and safeguarding freedom of navigation. Iran, in accordance with international law, has implemented necessary and precautionary measures to ensure the safety and security of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. These measures are designed to facilitate the continuous and safe passage of vessels while preventing the exploitation of this waterway for hostile or military purposes by aggressors and their affiliates. Second, the imposition of the maritime blockade announced by the United States constitutes a grave violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iran. This unlawful action is a flagrant breach of the prohibition on the threat or use of force enshrined in Article 2 and constitutes a clear act of aggression under international law. By seeking to obstruct maritime traffic and from Iranian ports, the United States unlawfully interferes with the exercise of sovereign rights of the Islamic Republic of Iran and infringes upon the rights of the third states on lawful maritime commerce under international law. The United States must bear full responsibility for this internationally wrongful act for any consequences arising therefrom, including the impact on the regional and international peace and security. The realization of principles of freedom of navigation and maritime safety in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, which lies within the territorial seas of its coastal states, is only possible through full respect for the sovereignty and sovereign rights of those coastal states. As such, sustainable stability in the Strait of Hormuz and in the region can only be achieved through the cessation of aggression and the full respect for Iran's legitimate right and interest. Third, over the past 40 days of the United States and Israeli regime war of aggression against Iran, the aggressors have crossed every legal, moral, and humanitarian boundary. They have violated international humanitarian law and committed war crimes by deliberately and indiscriminately targeting civilian infrastructure, including residential areas, schools, hospitals, healthcare facilities, airports, sport facilities, and cultural and historical sites. Furthermore, the United States utilized military bases and facilities located in the countries of the Persian Gulf region. Evidence indicates that military movement and operational preparation were underway at these bases for the planning, preparation, equipping, and execution of unlawful military attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite Iran's prior warning that such unlawful action were being planned. Iran has formally reported this development with supporting documentation to the Security Council and the Secretary General. Fourth, Iran welcomes and supports any diplomatic efforts and credible initiative capable to bringing about the sustainable end to this unlawful and unwarranted war, including all genuine efforts through Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as efforts by China and Russia. Any viable solution must ensure a definitive and irreversible end to the aggression and establish a just and durable peace grounded in the credible and verifiable guarantee against any recurrence. In this regard, we wish to express our sincere appreciation for the efforts of the government of Pakistan, particularly the Prime Minister and the Chief of the Army Staff, for their constructive mediation and for hosting these important negotiations. Despite our deep mistrust of the United States stemming from its repeated betrayal of diplomacy, we nevertheless entered the negotiation in good faith and remain cautiously optimistic. We believe that should the United States adopt a rational and constructive approach and refrain from advancing demands that are inconsistent with the international law, this negotiation can lead to a meaningful outcome. And finally, we categorically reject an unfounded and politically motivated allegation against my country made in this meeting. These claims lack any legal basis and serve only to divert attention from the realities on the ground, namely the illegal and savage war launched by the United States and Israeli regime against Iran. Some members referred to the Security Council Resolution 2817. Iran's legal position on this resolution have been circulated as a document of the General Assembly and the Security Council. Resolution 2817 disregards the unlawful war of aggression and armed attack by the United States and Israel against Iran, and in ignoring denies Iran inherent rights of self-defense exercised in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. By omitting any reference to the aggressors, the Council fails in its responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and instead by adopting such a politically motivated resolution risks legitimizing further act of aggression. It should be recalled that under international law the Security Council is bound to exercise its authority in full conformity with purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Any departure from these fundamental principles undermines the legal validity and moral authority of this decision. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark, followed by New Zealand and Australia.
Madam President, thank you for convening today's debate. It is vital that when the Security Council is silenced by the use of the veto, the United Nations as a whole is not. In this fragile moment for global affairs, the international community, including through the General Assembly, must let its collective voice be heard. Denmark strongly regrets that in the face of mounting escalation across the Middle East, the Security Council was unable to act due to the use of the veto by 2 permanent members. As the primary organ for the maintenance of international peace and security, this was an opportunity missed for a unified and collective response. The conflict in the Middle East has now been going on for more than 6 weeks, causing death and destruction throughout the region. Iran's actions near and around the Strait of Hormuz has led to food shortages, rise in energy prices, and other adverse effects across the world. Global growth, commerce, and development depend on the freedom of navigation. The repercussions for the global economy and, increasingly, for food security, in particular across developing countries, are enormous. As a great maritime nation, Denmark is committed to maritime security, to open sea lanes, and to the safety of all seafarers. Denmark's vote on April 7 reflected our belief in the urgent need to address these developments. We regret that the Council was not able to come together and present a joint solution. Madam President, we welcome the 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran and thank Pakistan and all parties involved for facilitating this important agreement. Denmark welcomes all diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions and find a negotiated settlement. A lasting ceasefire is an essential step towards a swift and permanent end to this war. All efforts and negotiations must be resumed in good faith. This conflict, however, is not confined to Iran or its neighbors across the Gulf. This situation in Lebanon, in particular, also risks spiraling out of control and puts at risk the current regional de-escalation. Denmark calls for the inclusion of Lebanon in regional de-escalation efforts and urges all parties to work toward a lasting political solution. It is crucial to protect civilian populations and critical infrastructure across the region. De-escalation and respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, remain as important as ever. These international rules were agreed upon after brutal lessons learned from war and devastation. All parties must keep these lessons in mind and abide by these important legal guardrails. Madam President, many aspects of this conflict have sent shockwaves across the globe. This is particularly true for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, caused by Iran's actions. This closure is not only a disruption, but a dangerous escalation measured in lives and livelihoods lost. It is vital to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Denmark stands ready, with our international partners, to contribute to this end. We thank the United Kingdom and France for their efforts to advance this vital work. Madam President, in closing, in today's interconnected world, conflict is rarely, if ever, contained to where it began. Its effects ripple across the globe, impacting countries and sectors seemingly far removed. This is the reality we're facing in the Middle East. This too must be the lens through which we find our solutions. We call on all parties to respect Security Council Resolution 2817, and we urge all to respect and abide by the Council's decisions. Denmark remains committed to safeguarding peace, security and stability in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
President, it is to New Zealand's deep disappointment that we meet again to discuss the use of the veto. New Zealand is a long-standing opponent of the veto. We are a strong supporter of Resolution 76/262 and are disappointed that it has been triggered so frequently. The Security Council's legitimacy lies in its ability to fulfill its responsibility under the UN Charter to maintain international peace and security and to address issues of pressing concern to member states. When a resolution is blocked through the use of the veto, the Council is deprived of that ability and its effectiveness and credibility are undermined. In this instance, 2 permanent members have prevented the Council from supporting an effort to ensure safe and secure navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. The closure of the strait is deeply damaging not only to supply chains but energy markets and food security, and is causing suffering around the world, especially among the world's most vulnerable. The resolution in question also contained important affirmations of navigational rights and freedoms. These are cornerstones of global security and prosperity that benefit every country. New Zealand was pleased to co-sponsor Resolution 2817 last month, one of a record number of member states, which reaffirmed the important concepts of freedom of navigation and maritime security. We welcome the continued efforts by Bahrain and the international community to restore safe passage to the Strait of Hormuz. As reaffirmed in Resolution 2817 and by the International Maritime Organization Council, the exercise of navigational rights and freedoms by merchant and commercial vessels in accordance with international law must be respected. We were therefore disappointed that the Council could not adopt the resolution last week. We particularly regret that, in this instance, the 2 permanent members who exercised the veto did so despite extensive efforts by the resolution's proponents to revise the text to accommodate the concerns of member states. New Zealand strongly reiterates the importance of ensuring that all ships and aircraft can exercise their right of transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz without interference in accordance with international law as reflected in UNCLOS. New Zealand remains deeply concerned about this conflict. Civilians and the global economy are being directly affected. It is critical that all parties uphold their commitment to the ceasefire and work to find an urgent diplomatic solution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia, followed by Vietnam and Ireland.
Thank you, President. Australia commends Bahrain and our Gulf partners for their efforts in the Security Council to ensure respect for navigational rights and freedoms in the Strait of Hormuz. We're disappointed that vetoes were exercised last week. Navigational rights and freedoms matter for all states. All states benefit from an open Strait of Hormuz and a safe and predictable environment for global supply chains. That's why Australia is participating in discussions on multinational diplomatic efforts to support navigational rights and freedoms. President, the human, security and economic impacts of the Iran conflict are significant and far-reaching. We condemn the indiscriminate attacks inflicted by Iran and its proxies across the Middle East, including against civilians, civilian infrastructure and commercial vessels. We welcome all efforts towards a de-escalation, including the ceasefire announced last week between the United States, Israel and Iran. Australia urges all parties to uphold the ceasefire in full. Negotiations must continue towards a resolution of the conflict, which will support a reopening of the Strait. The human cost and global economic impact of this conflict is mounting. The warnings, including this week from the IMF, are dire. We are seeing unprecedented shocks to global energy, fertilizer and petrochemical supplies, with immediate and long-lasting consequences reverberating around the world. In our region, Pacific Island countries are uniquely exposed to price volatility, supply chain disruptions and fuel shortages. More broadly, the World Food Programme has warned that Iran's actions in the Strait could push a further 45 million people into extreme hunger by June. The world's most vulnerable are most at risk. President, the expansion of the conflict into Lebanon, the loss of life and the displacement of more than 1.2 million civilians is deeply distressing. The ceasefire must be extended to Lebanon to prevent further loss of life and to give parties the space needed to negotiate a lasting settlement. President, Australia repeats its call for all parties across the region to uphold international humanitarian law and for civilians to be protected and to cease any attacks that deliberately threaten the safety and security of humanitarian personnel. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Madam President, Vietnam aligns itself with the statement delivered by the Philippines on behalf of ASEAN and wishes to highlight ASEAN's strong interest in the situation in the Middle East, marked by two special foreign ministers' meeting and the minister's statement. Vietnam remains deeply concerned by the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, including the latest developments in the Strait of Hormuz, which has caused immense human suffering and significant economic consequences. Its impacts extend well beyond the parties directly concerned, disrupting trade and energy supply chains, heightening political and economic uncertainties, and further constraining the development prospects of many countries, especially developing countries. We regret that the Security Council has not been able to take united and impartial actions to address the current crisis and its serious implications for regional peace and security. We strongly oppose the military attacks against sovereign states, particularly attacks against those countries that have declared their non-involvement. We are especially alarmed by and oppose attacks against civilians and civilians' infrastructure. In all circumstances, civilians and critical civilian infrastructure must never be targeted and attacked. Any such attack is in violation of international law and relevant UN resolutions, including Security Council Resolution 2573. This current crisis is yet again a manifestation of the erosion of international law, the continued infringement on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, the disrespect for the fundamental principles of no threat or use of force, and principle of peaceful settlement of disputes are in fact endangering the very foundations of the United Nations and our collective security architecture. Vietnam therefore calls on all parties to put an end to hostilities, especially attacks on civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, exercise maximum restraint and avoid actions that could lead to further escalation, miscalculation, and wider confrontation. We underscore the fundamental importance of respect for international law and the UN Charter. We firmly believe that international law must be applied consistently to all states, regardless of size and in all circumstances. Selectivity in the application of international law ultimately undermines international law to the detriment of smaller states. It is Vietnam's view that maritime safety and security, the freedom of navigation and overflight must be upheld in accordance with international law, especially the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is essential not only for the stability in the Middle East, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, but also for safeguarding the flow of energy and essential goods and preserving global economic stability. Finally, Madam President, the current crisis in the Middle East reminds us once again that only dialogue conducted in good faith and supported by genuine political will can pave the way toward lasting peace. We welcome the temporary ceasefire and encourage parties concerned to build on this momentum, to intensify diplomatic efforts, engage in meaningful dialogue, and pursue a balanced and constructive approach toward a sustainable and mutually acceptable solution. We commend efforts of countries and partners that have worked to maintain channels of communication, facilitate engagement, and create space for diplomacy. Such efforts are indispensable and deserve continued support. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland, followed by Brazil and the United States.
President, Ireland aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. It is deeply regrettable that last week the Security Council was unable to agree a resolution on the critical issue of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz to shipping. We would like to acknowledge the efforts undertaken by Bahrain to reach consensus on this important matter. We remain deeply concerned about the situation in the Middle East, including the continued restrictions on lawful transit passage and freedom of navigation near and in the Strait of Hormuz. The critical importance of the Strait has been clearly demonstrated in recent weeks. While the most immediate impact has been on states in the region, the reverberations have been felt across the world as trade of essential commodities and important supply chains have been severely disrupted. This disruption has a direct humanitarian, security and economic impact across the globe. It is likely that it will impact most heavily on the poorest and most vulnerable communities in relation to both energy and food security and hunger. Such restrictions and acts that threaten safe navigation through the Strait are simply unacceptable. We must be clear, maritime security, freedom of navigation and safe transit passage must be respected in line with international law, as reflected in UNCLOS and as affirmed in Security Council Resolution 2817. President, we welcome the recent ceasefire agreed by the United States and Iran, and we commend Pakistan for its mediation efforts. We sincerely hope the dialogue will continue, that progress can be made, and that a lasting agreement can be reached that will bring a permanent end to the conflict and ensure wider regional security. We continue to call for dialogue and diplomacy and for all parties to uphold international law, including the protection of civilians. We remain deeply concerned about the broader humanitarian and security situation in the Middle East. The situation in Lebanon is particularly concerning. We deeply regret that Israel has not extended a ceasefire to Lebanon. We have been clear in our condemnation of both Hezbollah's attacks on Israel and Israel's wholly disproportionate response. We urge Israel to halt its military operations and to allow the Lebanese armed forces to assert their role in providing security for Lebanon and the Lebanese people. We welcome the announcement of discussions between Israel and Lebanon, and we encourage the parties to seek a diplomatic solution. We stridently condemn all attacks against UNIFIL personnel. Finally, we must note our grave concern about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. We call on Israel to immediately remove restrictions on aid access and facilitate essential supplies and services to reach people across the Gaza Strip. We are also concerned about the situation in the West Bank, with continuing settlement activity and settler violence against Palestinian communities. Ordinary civilians continue to suffer the consequences of conflict and instability across the Middle East, with spillover effects across the globe. President, in spite of the challenges we face, we continue to believe that the UN and the multilateral system is fundamental to the delivery of peace and security for the Middle East. We hope that the Security Council will return to this matter in due course and provide the impetus for peace, lasting peace across the region. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this meeting. Brazil follows with attention and deep concern the situation in the whole Middle East. The recent escalation constitutes a serious threat to international peace and security, with dramatic humanitarian and economic consequences. Since the beginning of the present conflicts in the region, 2,100 people have lost their lives in Lebanon, 3,400 in Iran, 1,800 in Israel, and a staggering 72,000 confirmed deaths occurred in Gaza. Brazil condemns the attacks undertaken by the United States and Israel against Iran and the unwarranted subsequent attacks by Iran, and appeals to all parties to resume negotiations aiming at reaching a lasting solution for the conflict. The fact that these attacks were carried out once again in the midst of diplomatic conversations to reach an agreement is highly detrimental to the cause of peace and hinders the prospects for a lasting solution. Brazil condemns all attacks and military actions that resulted in civilian casualties, damage to civilian infrastructure, and violations of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Such actions are unacceptable and must cease immediately. All parties must strictly comply with international law, in particular international humanitarian law, ensuring the protection of civilians. Military escalation only deepens human suffering and undermines regional stability. The strike on a girls' school in the Iranian city of Minab, which claimed the lives of more than 150 innocent children, warrants the strongest condemnation. Brazil expresses its strong solidarity with the countries and peoples of the Gulf directly affected by the conflict. We also extend our condolences to the families of the victims in all states involved. Moreover, we express concern with the hindrance of innocent passage through the Strait of Hormuz and recall the importance of respecting the right of transit passage in straits in line with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We remain gravely concerned by the situation in Lebanon. We urge Israel to immediately halt its military actions and to withdraw all its forces from Lebanese territory. Furthermore, Brazil condemns the attacks against the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, and recalls that attacks against United Nations peacekeeping missions and facilities represent grave violations of international law and international humanitarian law. The United Nations must play a central role in the maintenance of international peace and security, with the Security Council bearing primary responsibility in this regard. At the same time, all member states should support the call for the immediate cessation of hostilities. We must act together to achieve a negotiated solution to the crisis and uphold the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and international law. We reiterate our support for the efforts of regional actors and other relevant partners, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Turkey, aimed at promoting de-escalation, dialogue and diplomatic solutions. We welcome initiatives that point toward a cessation of hostilities across the region and the resumption of negotiations, including for the peaceful reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. We urge all parties to engage in diplomatic efforts and negotiations in good faith to put an end to the ongoing conflicts. Dialogue remains the only viable path to building a sustainable peace. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States, followed by the United Kingdom and Pakistan.